existentialism tends to be an extremely broad idea, a broad theme. Much of it is covered in literature and art and so on, in playwriting specifically, but also theater, but also filmmaking, and it has had a very big influence on painting and on nearly all the arts. But it is difficult to talk about existentialism in the same way that one talks about, let's say, something like neo-Marxism or Marxism or whatever, because whereas neo-Marxism or Marxism tends to come out of one set of writings, and have sort of certain very common, clearly definable discipline themes and so on, ideas and issues that they look at. Existentialism tends to be much broader than that, doesn't come out of one particular source, has multiple sources, and therefore comes to multiple conclusions as well. But what can be said about it is, the way I like to think about it is that it is the great turn inwards, looking at things that are that you would not look at in terms of political economy. You may not look at it in terms of overthrowing the state, but you look at it in terms of questions that you raise within your own life at the individual level, maybe also at the collective level, but certainly at the individual level. So whereas the great turn inwards does not characterize every major existentialist idea, because some existentialist ideas certainly do talk about collectivities and about collective change and so on, but I think as a whole, this phrase helps me capture what existentialism can be described as a whole. So in the reading, you had they sort of took existentialism and they identified 7 key themes that are associated with this trend in philosophy or in political philosophy. And that means, of course, that not every writer writes about every trend, but these 7 broad themes come to capture much of what we consider to be the existentialist discourse or critique. Firstly, philosophy as a way of life, anxiety and authenticity, freedom, situatedness, existence, irrationality, absurdity, and the crowd. So we're going to go through these ideas one by one, first and foremost, and then very briefly we will look at some of the major existentialist writers, and then we'll have a discussion on it. So to begin with, philosophy as a way of life. For Socrates and for the Stoics and for the Epicureans, philosophy was not meant for only the select few that would understand the ways of the truth. Although a select few there may only be a few people who understand the ways of the truth. But Socrates always thought of philosophy as being fundamental to understanding the basic ideas of life, and therefore potentially graspable by everyone, though people may choose not to grasp it. And so philosophy was not meant to be a specialized subject as it was first seen by the Greeks, but rather meant to challenge some of the assumptions of everyday life. And the most important idea that it wanted to challenge is, what is the good life? What does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be virtuous? How can we be good? Can we be good by following the Greek religion, or is there some other way to be good? So the central idea that animated Greek philosophers was not for a specialized discipline, but for an idea that would help us lead better lives. And I think when we talk about existentialism, we have the same common idea with the ancient Greeks. That is, everyone should contemplate about the mysteries of life. In fact, some existentialists would say everyone does contemplate about the mysteries of life. Everyone is, in one sense, a philosopher, whether they recognize themselves as being a philosopher or not. You may not be familiar with the terminology, the sort of specialized terminology of philosophy, but that doesn't mean you don't think about the mysteries of life. And existentialists want to make that point, that we all think about these things, and we ought to think about these things, and the function of the philosopher should be to inform everyday life, to help you lead better lives. So that builds on ideas of Kant, the Neoplatonists, Schelling, Hegel, who also thought of philosophy as an activity that is an integral part of the history of human beings. Remember, for Hegel, for instance, all of history moved according to this massive dialectical philosophical movement. Marx famously said that the point of philosophy is not to interpret the world, but to change it. And that's an idea that every existentialist philosopher more or less has agreed with, that the point of philosophy, of academics, of scholarship, of thinking, of universities, all of these, all intellectual activity should be for us to be able to come up with a life that is better than the life that we have already. So, why is that not the case according to existentialist philosophers? The way in which capitalism and modern society operate, we have an intellectual division of labor, where some people perform manual labor and other people get to go to college and university and ponder about the metaphysical, transcendental qualities of life. And it shouldn't be this way. It ought not to be this way. This is you could say, a judgment of some sort. Because what this has done is that it has made philosophy the preserve of of college book, college room discussions and cafe discussions, where it ought to be discussions that are even held in the workplace, on the streets, wherever one goes. Socrates himself was very much a street philosopher. He liked to go into the bazaar and strike up a conversation with people who would not be considered intellectuals in that sense. But he didn't think of them as being less than intellectuals. He nonetheless engaged them in very stimulating conversations. So one of the things that existentialist writers began to do, although they can also write in very terse, difficult language, is that they began to write in many different ways. In fact, they began to write plays. Theater. They began to write theater through which they felt that they could inform, with a story, they could inform their audiences about existentialist ideas in philosophy and so on. So they experimented with the way they wrote, they experimented with the way they communicated in order to bring philosophy to the people. By this time in Europe, when existentialism begins to take off, already now there is a very highly developed tradition, in my view, of these debates between socialism and capitalism and fascism and so on that have touched people on a mass level. So some of that is already very much present. There's a vibrant atmosphere of these ideas being discussed through political life in Europe in the post-war period anyway. The second theme within philosophy as a way of life is the idea of immanence, which is when something is within something else, when something is immersed in something else. Philosophy studies life from the inside, is the idea that existentialists would like us to accept. That we are not somehow the other outside of the life that we are attempting to study. We are part of the life that we are attempting to study. We are part of the process that we ourselves are trying to study. So there is no God's eye view of the world. We are, within, we are part of the world that we are trying to study. Kierkegaard, for example, said that the fundamental truths are not representations, i.e. representations of the real world that are in my mind and so on. Rather, the truths of existence are immediately lived, felt, and acted. Similarly, Nietzsche and Heidegger say that the philosopher investigating human existence is him or herself an existing human. So it is a self-inquiry, and we are, as it were, a scientist will create a laboratory, and in the laboratory they'll have some equipment, and on the equipment they will do this experiment. The scientist, him or herself, is not part of the experiment, is outside of the experiment. And the things that are moving in the experiment are the things that he's studying. Well, that can never happen, say the existentialists, as far as these questions of philosophy and politics are concerned, because you can never be outside of society and then looking into society. You're part of the process that you yourself are studying. If I'm studying the class structure of Pakistan, how can I not be aware that I am part of the class structure of Pakistan? I'm part of that class society. I'm a product of it. Ahmed? All right. So, and finally, life is an existentialist concern. The nature of life itself is a perennial existentialist concern, and more famously, with Heidegger and Camus, the significance of death is very, very central to existentialism. So what do we mean when we say life is an existentialist concern? We are all concerned with the question of life and death and mortality. Either we are trying to overcome mortality in the effort to create a better life, which seems to be when Nietzsche says we want, we should embrace that which brings about the will to power, which expands life, that is, on the one hand, simultaneously a recognition that life is limited, and on the other hand, a rebellion against the idea that life is limited. So we know that we can't win that struggle, but as what was it? Keats said, rage against the dying of the light. Was it Keats? Sorry, who's it again? Yes, I've also forgotten. Was it? Anyway, I've forgotten. But a very famous poem, right? Rage against the dying of the. Do not go silently into the night. Rage against the dying of the light. Then, the second major theme is, and this is one of the biggest themes, is anxiety and the idea of authenticity. I'm not sure if you can see the lovely images that I selected for you. Believe me, I spent a significant amount of time trying to find an image that would capture anxiety without making you anxious at the same time. So one idea that existentialist philosophers try to elaborate again and again, and I make no bones about this fact, that existentialism is a pretty dark philosophy, right? It is at one level quite pessimistic about life. The one major theme that you will see throughout is that life is suffering. The attempt to alleviate suffering is an impossible one. You will see this repeated a lot in existential philosophy, and this is true both at the individual level, and it will also be true you'll see at the collective level. At the individual level, you could say that you try and fill up the suffering or your unhappiness in life. How do you try and make yourself happy? In a consumer capitalist society, the way you try to make yourself happy is by buying a new iPhone. It's by getting new clothes, and it's by consuming more and more. Every time you go to the supermarket, you buy something, or to the market, you buy something, you feel just a little bit happy. You feel this bump, and for a day or 2 or 3, you're enjoying your new toy or your new clothes or whatever, your new car or whatever it is that you've bought, and you are happy for 2-3 days. But then the void comes right back in your life, and you have to go back and buy something. You can never fill that void with the stuff that you buy. It just never happens. You can see this theme being repeated a lot in movies, in poems, in songs, etc. It's a very anti-consumerist theme, and of course existentialist philosophy we owe credit to existentialism to have brought this up. Secondly, you will see later on that they also talk about how at the collective level we are constantly trying to make life better. We're trying to fight disease, we're trying to finish poverty, we are trying to save the world these days from environmental catastrophe. We keep doing this, and yet we keep failing, and if we succeed in one thing, it is only to discover that comes in front of us. It seems to be a never-ending thing. We just cannot get out of suffering. Suffering, therefore, according to existentialist philosophers, we should embrace it as a part of what makes us human. It's almost like if you did not have pain, in fact, we hate pain, right? But pain is absolutely integral to the survival of your species. Because if I were to create you, aapka kya naam hai? Sorry? Ali. Ali, if you were born and you could not feel pain, you'd think life would be so much simpler, right? Abu Jaan thappad marenge, you'd be like, hey, I didn't feel a thing. You fell off the couch, you fell off a horse, you fell off a cycle, you don't feel a thing. If life was without pain, we at first think, naively, life would be so much better. But the fact of the matter is that if the human organism or any organism did not feel pain, it would not protect itself from harmful effects. You'd have your hand over a fire, and you would not notice that your hand is on fire, and pretty soon you'd be burnt to crisp, you'd be burnt to a toast. You'd never realize the things that are hurting you. Your pain mechanism is actually one of the most important mechanisms that you have for your survival. It immediately tells you, do not put weight on that leg because that joint is hurting, there's something happening there that's wrong. Don't put weight on it, otherwise it will get worse. Right, Paras? Right? And we try to dull it with painkillers, etc. The idea is that when you do take a painkiller, you're supposed to act like you still have that pain, because if you take a painkiller and you act like you don't have that pain, you will make your pain worse. You'll ruin your body, in fact. So pain is very important. And what about psychological pain? It's equally important. For a child, it's important to learn what's good and bad and what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior and so on. You can't just go around hurting people. You can't just go around, doing bad things and so on. That would make a reckless society, civilization, that it would make us, you wouldn't be able to construct a civilization if we didn't care for each other, and we wouldn't care for each other if at some level we didn't feel some psychological pain from each other. After all, it's not just being given a slap across the face that hurts. What hurts even more is to be told that you are, by somebody that you care about, whose opinion you care about. When somebody whose opinion you care about tells you that you were a bad person for doing X, Y, Z, it hurts. It physically, almost like physically hurts, right? And that also is a mechanism to tell you what sort of behaviors you ought to do and what sort of behaviors you shouldn't do, and so on. So we existentialist philosophers are of the opinion we can try and alleviate suffering, but this is never going to happen. And that is the idea that human existence is in some way on its own. We are lonely in this world. Everything that we see around us, all the objects that we see, out of all the things that we see, there is nothing quite like humanity. In other words, there is no other being that we know of that has self-reflexivity, that can think about its own existence, that has self-consciousness. In that sense, existentialist philosophy says we are quite lonely. We have nobody else to ask these vital questions about life and death and so on. We can't ask a table, we can't ask animals. None of them have the level of self-reflexivity that we do. So it is in that sense that existentialist philosophers say that we are on our own, we are lonely, and this causes anxiety, anguish. It is the recognition of this loneliness that causes it. It's not just the loneliness that Afia says, today I wanted to go and have ice cream, all my friends went and had ice cream and they didn't invite me. That's not the only kind of loneliness we're talking about. That may be there, but that's a very low level of loneliness. Existentialist loneliness is the understanding that there is no entity in the world that can help humanity understand its own condition. Earlier on, we thought that God helps us understand our condition. Today in the world, as Nietzsche has said, God is death. We thought that science could be the new God. Today in the world, we think not only is God dead, but the truth is dead. There is no such thing as a truth. There's no way to it, to find it. There's nobody to tell us what the truth is. What does death mean? What does life mean? How do I process it? And so on. We've got to do all this processing on our own. This causes anguish and anxiety. Now you're thinking, sir, it doesn't cause me any anguish, but let's continue and see how that works out. Existentialists also wanted you to think about passions rather than reason. They thought that what science had done is rationality, objectivity, all of these ideas had done is, they're supposed to be, when you do a scientific investigation of something, you're supposed to leave your passions and subjectivity out of it. You're supposed to be dispassionate about it. This is a phrase that all scientists use. Be dispassionate about it. Don't be biased, they say, right? But we don't experience the world in this way. We don't experience anything in this way. We always experience everything through our emotions. And this psychology completely accepts. We are not robots. We never have been. Our memory systems also operate in accordance with things that scare us or things that we love, things that move us, we remember very firmly. Things that don't move us, we simply don't remember, we forget. We forget them in the evening. I had breakfast. Actually, I didn't have breakfast. But the point is, whatever I ate in the morning, I don't remember what I ate in the morning. I don't even know whether I ate in the morning. It had no emotional impact on me. But if my daughter comes and kisses me and says, Babu, I love you, I'll miss you in school, it has an emotional impact on me. I remember it the whole day. I may remember it for years afterwards. So our memory, the way we perceive things, is deeply, deeply enmeshed with our emotions. And yet when we study things, we leave all of that out. Existentialist think that this is not a very good way to understand how we look at and understand the world. Life is without reason, it is without morality, and it is without empirical evidence. If you think that you can find the meaning of life by opening up the sacred book, which we've done for thousands of years, already the Enlightenment has so convinced you that that is not that will not provide you with any answers. If you think that a man in a white coat is going to be able to provide you with all the correct answers, we have shown that men in white coats have done horrible, terrible things to the world. If you think that empirical evidence, statistics, data, all these tables are going to provide you the evidence, we have shown you that there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics, right? Very famous saying, right? God, not only is God dead, but the idea that there is a truth, an absolute truth that can be understood. The great Socratic mission was to find that absolute truth, to find a method that could move us into that absolute truth. Well, Socrates is dead. The Socrates mission is dead. There is no such thing as the absolute truth. It cannot be found. And that is the uniqueness of the human condition, which is that we are in this world and we have no rock to stand on. We have no anchor from where we can peg our ships. We are as if afloat. We have no basis to say what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is false. Shifting sands, how do we once again anchor ourselves? That is what causes anxiety. That is the foundation of anxiety. What about authenticity then? The fact that one is on one's own as a human being, that is the only self-reflexive creature that we know about, we should need to find a way that we are not conforming to the crowd and are understanding the nature of existence as suffering. So what we tend to do is we very easily conform to what everybody's doing. However everyone has answered the question of what is the meaning of life, that's how I'll answer the question of what is the meaning of life. But by doing that, I am becoming inauthentic. What does that mean to become inauthentic? I'm not thinking for myself. It's not my answer. It's not an authentic answer because it hasn't come from me. I heard it from Afia, I heard it from somebody else, and I just repeated it like a parrot. I heard it from Taimur Rahman, I repeated it. That's not an authentic answer. Aapka kya naam hai? Abbas, you didn't think about that answer. You merely parroted me. Hence, it's not authentic. Secondly, the inauthenticity comes from the fact that man is slowly being turned into a machine. And I put Mr. Arnie Schwarzenegger up there for all of you. Machine becomes man, man becomes machine. What is happening in society is that we are being programmed by universities, by the media, by politicians, everybody, to think about reason, value things in an instrumentalist way. Everything is about cost-benefit analysis. We are being taught to think like a machine. We are being taught to evaluate people like machines. When I finish my course, you're going to evaluate me on what are those, sort of things that you say, his teaching was 1 to 5. How dare you put a number on the pearls of wisdom that I am giving to you, right? And when at the end of the year, I want to do my faculty scholarly report, I'm going to be forced by the university to put a number on myself. How would you rate your own teaching on a scale of 1 to 10? How can my creative impulses be instrumentalized with a number? It sounds absurd. What about my emotions? What about the time I gave up with my family to come here and prepare this for you yesterday? And what does that count? I mean, how do you quantify that? Right? The attempt to quantify everything, to think of things with this instrumentalist conception of reason, this instrumentalist conception of value, this utilitarian theory, this constant cost benefit. If I go visit my grandmother, I will get 10 utils of goodness in my mind. But if I go and have ice cream, I will get 11 units of utils. Screw grandma. Excuse me, let's censor that. But let's go have ice cream. Is this any way to think? Right? Is this any way to think? Ask existentialist philosophers. We are abandoning the spiritual dimension of our being. We are thinking of ourselves as machines, and that is a very, very negative thing, because at the end of the day, we are not machines. And the more that we begin to think like machines, the more inauthentic we are becoming for ourselves. We are narrowing the possibilities of human to the instrumental and technological. Take, for instance, I mean, we do it to you people all the time, right? We're doing it to you right now with class participation. This comment is worth 1 point. This comment is worth 0.75 points. How do I know? Maybe your comment sounds stupid now, but you come up with some brilliant theory out of it 10 years later that shakes the world up. And I didn't even give it like 0.5, in my comment section. I don't know. So, it's... and we're limiting our interaction. People are raising their hands. Why are they raising their hands? Because they need to get that point, so they need to make, sir, I've got a point to make. Actually, you don't have any point to make. We just want the point to be recorded, right? If there wasn't there, then you probably wouldn't have made the point. Inauthentic class participation. And don't we do that everywhere, in everything we do? We pretend to, be people that we are not. We pretend to quantify things that are unquantifiable, and we live a life like that, and we think it's fine. Let's say the music society. Anybody in the music society in LUMS? Great. Okay, one person. What CGPA do you need to be part of the music society at LUMS? Minimum CGPA. No, but what CGPA do you need to be? I mean, there's a CGPA. If you slip below it, you can't be part of any society. You do? What is it?
It's 2.5 CGPA.
Yeah. Oh, for executive. All right. So maybe we have a bloody Mozart sitting over here, but because he can't get above 2.5, he's not going to be head of the music society. He might change the entire world, but because he can't get 2.5 because he doesn't like calculus or something, right? He can't be in the executive committee of the music society. Isn't that absurd? You may say, right? But we do this. That's what we do all the time. And what else do? We are monetizing everything constantly. Everything is about money, buying time from people. If I can't get a friend, I will hire a friend. You know how to hire a friend? It's called a psychologist, right? You couldn't find somebody to... It's the truth. You didn't find somebody to spend time with and unload, in normal life, back in the day when there was no psychology, right? What did people do? They met with their friends, they had chai, coffee, they had a drink, they went to the pub, whatever. They met up, they went to the chai khana, and they would bitch about their lives and said, God, yeah, today I had a terrible day at work, my crop didn't do too well, this is happening, that's happening, my wife is on my case, or my husband is on my case, whatever, XYZ, then you felt better. You're like, oh, I've offloaded. And now people are just too busy. The busier people get, the less friends people have, right? In New York City and in San Francisco, busiest cities in the world, there's an obsession with psychologists. Because nobody's got time to sit around listening to you moan and bitch about your work. They have better things to do, although they also want to moan and bitch about work. So you hire people to listen to you while you moan and bitch about work. Inauthentic existence. That's what it's all about. Right. So that's what we're doing. We're constantly rating people. Oh, yeah, rating people. Talk about social media. This is my good friend because I gave him 500 likes. This is not my good friend because he gave me 300 likes. What is going on? Is this how we rate people by, whether or not you like their comments and stuff? Totally inauthentic existence. The human element, the real passions, the emotions, the real connections, all of that is out the window. Maybe I should have taught this section of the course. Maybe we should arrange this section of the course in such a way that we taught this after Shamail taught rational choice theory, but it's a bit late for that now. All right, so next theme amongst existentialist philosophers is the idea of freedom. This rise of rationality that has resulted in the horrors of modernity, such as world wars, genocide, the killing of entire people, on a scale which has never occurred before. The 20th century was supposed to be the age of science and objectivity and rationality and all of these beautiful things and education and so on and so forth. We have killed more people in the 20th century than we have killed in all the previous centuries put together. That's what yes, did you not know that? Absolutely, hands down. I mean, we have killed, we would put Halaku Khan and Changiz Khan to shame. They would seem like wimpy little babies compared to what we have done in the 20th century. We have upscaled murder to the industrial level. Halaku Khan, Changiz Khan would have said about the gas chambers of Auschwitz that this is horrible. How dare you do this sort of inhuman stuff? If you want to kill somebody, you should kill them with your own bare hands, with your sword, you know. That's the real manly way to kill somebody, not put them in gas chambers. This is a cowardly way, and so on. But that's what we've done. I am not in any way condoning killing people with your bare hands. I'm just trying to make some idea. Sometimes I'd say things just because they sound funny, okay? Sometimes I think they'll sound funny, but they don't sound funny at all. Anyway. So this has resulted in a crisis of values, leading to further anguish. We were supposed to march into a world of liberty, equality, fraternity, reason, science, enlightenment. We marched backward into darkness. Freedom. Sartre says man is condemned to be free. Ali, Soreo, Zara jago. You are condemned to be free. You have a choice. The choice is you can go to sleep, or you can stay awake and listen to how you are condemned to be free. Every moment we make a choice. Even the fact that we are alive is a choice. We could choose not to live if we wanted to. Therefore, if we are making a choice at every step of the way, we are therefore responsible for every decision that we take, whether it is to sleep in class or to stay awake, to sit in class or to walk out, to question or not to question, to support your officer when he says, gas these Jews, to support your commander when he says, get these children, put machine guns into the hands of these children and mow down your enemies. We make child warriors. We cannot make the excuse, as Jean-Paul Sartre said about the trial at Nuremberg, that I did it because everybody else was doing it, or I did it because he told me to do it and he's my superior officer. Whatever you do, you as an individual are responsible for it. Yes. So the next question. We are, existentialists always admit, always in a certain context. So it's not the case that there are no economic circumstances, there are no social circumstances. They're not saying that. One's freedom is always situated within context. Abstracting from context makes freedom naive or illusionary, says Immanuel Kant. Being in the world, being there in the world is part of the ontological structure of existence. So we are always part of some situation. They're not denying that. We're always part of some political, historical, economic, gendered, whatever, heteronormative framework. That is absolutely the case. What we can look, if we break that up, we can see first and foremost is my body. And that is one of the primary facts about me. Nietzsche says that, Schiller says that, Merleau-Ponty says that. It has, and of course this had a massive influence on gender studies. That the one thing that I cannot escape, no matter where I am, is that I am my body. I may be a little more than my body as well, but I cannot not be my body. I cannot be out of my body. Secondly, are the social circumstances, which of course include class. Each of my acts says something about how I view others, but reciprocally, each of their acts is a view about how I am. And this derives from the idea of Hegel's idea of recognition through another. It is only when someone else who has self-consciousness recognizes me as a self-consciousness that I recognize myself as having a self-consciousness, says Hegel in the master-slave dialectic, if you remember from my previous course. So, and of course, Karl Marx's idea that there are economic and political circumstances. And last but not least, there is a history. How did we get here? What did Bahadur Shah Zafar do? How was he, humiliated in Rangoon and so on? All that history is there. You cannot turn back the clock. Colonialism is a fact. All of these things are facts. So they're not denying those facts when they say you take your decisions. They are saying you always take those decisions within a historical circumstance, within the circumstance of your body, within the circumstance of your class, and so on. And they're sensitive to that. There's no doubt about that. But they don't necessarily, that doesn't mean that they're Marxists when they talk about class, but they always do want you to understand that that context is present. You can't deny it either, right? Yes. Finally, not finally, actually, we have 2-3 more things to go. But existence, human existence cannot be understood on the model of things. We don't exist in the same way that this table exists. We can study this table scientifically, say existentialists, right? Because it's an object. But you, kya naam hai aapka with the red hair? Vajdan, you are not an object. You are a thinking being. You are not a table. So therefore, when I ascribe to you qualities like I can say this table weighs this much, it is made of this material, etc., etc. When I say the same things about you, yeah, part of that is true. You have a certain weight. You are made of certain chemicals, etc. But it would be so incomplete if I just described those things, because I'm sure there's another human being who's made of the same chemical combination with roughly the same weight. You, Vajdan, are you not because of your material properties, but because of your temporal properties, because of your intellectual properties, your ability to reflect and think and be a self-consciousness. And therefore, when we examine people in the same way that we examine things, we do a great violence to people, we do a great violence to humanity. We don't really understand humanity as humanity. We rather try to understand humanity as we would understand things, which is why social science is kind of a failed project. We need phenomenology instead of scientific positivist objectivity, because human beings are not like things. They cannot be studied with the same tools that we use for science. Human existence is action. My acts are free. I am not free. I am not free not to act. I am always, even when I don't act, that is a conscious decision. You're not acting you're not getting up and going, you're passively sitting there, but that's a decision you're taking. That's also an action. Sartre says, existence precedes essence, is one of his most famous quotes. The other one is, man is condemned to be free. What does he mean? We have come into this world without having defined what our purpose is. Our existence comes about without having defined what the purpose of that existence is, collectively as well as individually. The table has an essence which is defined before the table is created. I thought of the table. The table is going to do this. I'm going to be able to put things on its surface. That was the purpose of the table. That is the essence of a table. If I can't put something on the surface, it's not a table, is it? So the essence of the table is defined before the table is created. But the essence of humanity is not defined. There is no meaning to life given to you before you were born or before humanity came about. What we thought was the meaning to life given to us turned out not to be correct, i.e. religion. Therefore, we are the authors of what we want to become. Humanity must decide what it wants to become. Your purpose, individually and collectively as a human being, is not going to be given to you by anybody outside of you. It's not going to be given by anything in nature. You have to choose it for yourself. And this is the fundamental, how should I put it, tension, existentialist question of life. What is the meaning of life? Nobody can tell you. You have to come up with it on your own. Nobody outside of you can tell you, individually or as humanity as a whole. Yes. Oh. This famous artwork, can you get the light so I can show it to everybody, is the representation of a very famous novel called Metamorphosis, in which this man wakes up. Every morning he wakes up and he goes to work. He brushes his teeth. Yeah, I think it's on the other side. He brushes his teeth and so on. He goes to work. But one morning when he wakes up, he discovers that he's not a human being. What is he instead? He's a cockroach. That's right. He's a cockroach. He changes into a cockroach. What is Kafka trying to say? What's the point? They're saying that life is absurd. You're going to wake up one morning and be a cockroach. Well, not exactly. But it's a metaphor that life and human existence is absurd. Why is it absurd? Because nature has no design for you. It's not given you a purpose. There is no reason for your existence. You don't exist in order to appease Zeus so that he'll be kind on you. That was just made up by Greeks. You don't exist. There is no reason for you to exist. There is no reason that I can think of for you to exist. You just do exist. And then you define your own reason, yes. So from the point of view of rationality, freedom is absurd. Why? There is no rational basis upon which one makes the choice of the code to follow. There is no basis for us to say what is right or wrong. Look, yaar, it's a very simple thing. People got together and said, this is right, that is wrong. People got together and said, when your husband dies, we want you to jump into the funeral fire and kill yourself, right? Nobody else took that. Excuse me if anybody's offended by that. But that decision didn't come from beyond. It was a social decision that we took. And that is the reality about all the decisions that we take, say existentialists, that these are all decisions that you and I have taken without there necessarily being any fundamental basis for them, for one decision to have been better than the other one. So if there is no rational basis upon which one makes the choice of the code to follow, freedom is doomed to destroy itself, because a free action once undertaken is no longer free. It becomes an aspect of the objective world. Once I undertake an action, I have externalized my idea into the world. That idea becomes something. It becomes an institution. It becomes a way. It becomes a book. It becomes an object. It becomes a thing I've made. A thing. In becoming, therefore, which was a choice, it was my free choice, I must become what I am not, which is a thing. I make myself into a thing. And this idea will continue, you'll see in the future. So therefore, life is absurd. It's irrational. It's not rational at all. Because on the one, there is no scientific basis on which you can say this idea is better than that idea. And two, because whatever it is that you turn yourself into, you are only going to defeat yourself. Suffering is inevitable. Anxiety is inevitable. Because as soon as you make that decision and act on that decision, your actions on that decision become something. They become what you make, the chair, the state, the society, the work of art. It becomes a thing. Or you become a thing. You decided to become a literature major, a writer, a critic, a professor, a doctor, a teacher, whatever it is that you decide to become. What is that? It's nothing but a thing. And a quality that an object has rather than something that continues to change. I'm not a teacher if I've decided that I'm not going to be a teacher, but I'm going to just study and learn and then, I don't know, do what. But I'm not going to be permanently a teacher. So when I become that thing that I projected myself to become, I've turned myself into a thing already. And that defeats the very purpose. So it's an absurdity you can't get rid of, yes. Last but not least, the crowd. Inauthenticity manifests itself as de-individuated people or faceless people who just follow the crowd. The crowd, the horde, the herd, the masses, all of these things are negative terms for existentialists who want you to have your individuality. But that individuality is not conformity to the latest fads, to the latest fashions, to the latest trends, to the latest gossips, rituals, consumerism, nationalism, socialism, democracy, social media, or even existentialism as a fad. That is not what he's talking about. What he means is that all of this can be done in an authentic or an inauthentic way, depending on whether or not it emerges from within or from without. Can a collective form of existence be authentic, or will it always be inauthentic, given that we are part of crowds and masses and fads and fashions and so on? Nietzsche says, yes, friendship is an aid to the transformation of humanity into a better, higher form of humanity. Heidegger says an authentic mode of being with others, another way of putting the same idea of friendship, can transform you. And Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir say an authentic commitment to a social cause like gender equality or whatever can have that transformative effect. Kierkegaard, the man who started it all, hated Hegel. He's a father of existentialism. He says Hegel reduced Christianity to a moment in the rational development of mankind. He didn't like that at all. Hegel famously said, all that is real is rational, and what is rational is real. The rational becomes real. Reason, the spirit reason, becomes real through the manifestation of civilization. And the manifestation of civilization follows a logic, a reason, etc. So the rational, the idea, becomes real in civilization. And the real becomes rational in the sense that the civilization is a process of getting to know its own reason, getting to know itself, emerging into the end of history. A lot to take in, I know. There's a very, very extremely short summary of Hegel. But that was Hegel's idea. And in that march, Hegel said, you know, Hinduism, Buddhism was one stage, and Christianity is another stage, Islam is another stage, and we're just moving across these stages. And now the last and final stage will be the stage of modernity, science, you know, ethical society, and so on and so forth, rationality, reason, etc. Of course, Hegel was also a supporter of the French Revolution, etc. Kierkegaard says, what a load of rubbish! That is not how history works. You have reduced man to a tool of history. This is absolutely not true. In fact, the nature of truth is that truth is, which is truth to me. That means truth is subjective, it is personal. He wanted the suspension of reason, and he thought that the suspension of reason is the heart of religion and Christianity. Religion cannot be reasoned, it has to be lived. The human is a passionate animal, born from emotions. If human beings were a beast or an angel, he could not be in anxiety because he is a synthesis. He can be in anxiety, and the more profoundly he is in anxiety, the greater is the man. Anxiety is the normal, suffering is the normal human condition, as Jesus suffered on the cross. The point you raised earlier, and the excellent point you raised earlier. Suffering cannot be alleviated. It is what makes us human. Christ on the cross symbolizes it. I told you it was going to come. I wasn't lying. Nietzsche, I know my lot, he said. Someday my name will be linked to the memory of something monstrous, of a crisis as yet unprecedented on earth. Good God, the man must have seen the future, because he was linked then later, of course, as you know, to fascism. The death of God is a death of truth. It gives rise to a millennia of nihilism. Humanity itself must define its own meaning and the meaning of its existence. You can see this theme continuing in existentialism. The Übermensch, if I didn't get the pronunciation wrong, thank you, is the unity of the contradictory forces of man as an animal and man as a rational creature. And this is what allows us to transcend nihilism. All the philosophers have been handling for thousands of years have become conceptual mummies. Nothing real has ever left their hands alive. I would say this about Lums, frankly. Every great idea, university life in general, every great idea that animated the world and made people kill each other becomes, in the context of a university, something dead, boring. Ali starts snoring, you want to have a break, etc., etc. That's basically what philosophers have done to the world. They've destroyed these animating ideas, And morality aims to limit the creative power of this animal instinct, which is very important, says Nietzsche. And of course this distinction goes all the way back to St. Augustine, and even earlier all the way to the Greeks, right? But this animal part of you is also very, very important. Morality is arrogant. Why? Because the will to power are those ideas that preserve and develop life, and morality's purpose is really not to develop the will to power, but to subdue it. The human is not an end in itself, but a means to something perfect, completely finished, happy, powerful, triumphant, that still leaves something to fear. So Nietzsche wants you to overcome yourself and become better than yourself, etc. And so Nietzsche might not have regarded himself as an existentialist philosopher, but he is considered as part of the heritage that inspires it. Same with Heidegger. He influenced Sartre, Gadamer, Arendt, Hannah Arendt, Marcuse, Derrida, Foucault. Human existence cannot be understood with the tools of natural science. What is the meaning of that being which is not an entity like other beings, for example, a chair, a car, a rock, and yet through it entities have meaning at all, is the essential question of Heidegger. What does that mean? That means that we have human beings. Again, to put it very simply, human beings are very different from chairs, cars, rocks, and other things, because all of those things are unable to think about themselves. So how do we, who think about ourselves, have meaning, given that we ourselves give ourselves meaning? This is the confusing bit. Nothing outside of us gives us that. So Aristotle answers this question by saying it is substance, matter, that's why he's considered a materialist, which pervades everything, including human beings, and we are made of that. And this is the ancient subject-object distinction that we see in philosophy, that the subject is the conscious element, the object is the element about which you have consciousness, what you're thinking about, what exists outside of consciousness. Now this subject-object distinction is exactly what Heidegger wants to destroy in philosophy. He says, instead of that, he poses the concept of design, that is being there in the world. So the idea of immanence comes back up, that you are part of the world that you're trying to describe. You are what you're trying to describe. We already exist in the world that we are trying to understand, hence no subject-object distinction can exist because the subject is thinking about the object, which is itself the subject. So the subject is thinking about the subject, it's thinking about itself. So there is no subject-object distinction in that sense. But the subject is also an object in the sense that it exists in the world. But it exists there in the world and it's thinking about itself. So where do we end up? In a situation where the subject-object distinction, which is where Descartes begins modern philosophy. I think, therefore I am. I exist because I think, right? Cogito ergo sum, right? That distinction he wants to throw out. He says that's the fault. That's where all the muck and filth of modernity begin. Yes. Jean-Paul Sartre is the person that we need to cover, really. अच्छा, मैं तुम्हें भेज दूंगा, don't worry. He's the most influential of philosophers. He was very much inspired by phenomenology, which is that consciousness cannot be just consciousness of consciousness. It has to be consciousness of something. I am conscious that she is beautiful. I am conscious that I'm in class today. Consciousness is always directed. That's called intentionality. So Sartre says, if I love her because she is lovable. Lovableness is not an aspect of my image of her, but a feature of her. If it is a feature of her, then consciousness is not a thing and not subject to the laws of things, says Sartre. Consciousness, he says controversially, is nothing. It's not a thing in the sense, so it's nothing. It's not nothing in the sense that it doesn't exist. It's nothing in the sense it's no thing. It's not a thing. It's not an object. You say, my wife is, if you say my wife is very lovable, then I will probably not very like you very much. I'll be very jealous or something. But if I say my wife is also lovable. But the point is, if I say my wife is lovable, Jean-Paul Sartre says that even that is a form of objectification, because I am ascribing to her a fixed quality that I would ascribe to a thing. This is very different from the objectification that perhaps you are familiar with in sort of first wave or second wave gender theory, which was that you turn a person into an object in the sense that you treat a person as an object in the sense that you deny their agency, you deny their ability to think for themselves, and you portray them not as a subjective being but as an object. That is objectification in the non-existentialist use of the word. But in the existentialist use of the word, and that is very clearly demeaning to the other person, right? When you are utilizing them as an object rather than viewing them as a human being capable of thought. That is obviously very demeaning. To our sensitivities today, in particular, that is obvious that is demeaning. But Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir mean objectification at an even deeper level. Even when you're paying somebody a compliment, they are saying, even when you're saying, kya naam aapka? Imad, you're a smart chap, right? Even if I say that is a form of objectification. I'm ascribing to you a fixed quality. Maybe tomorrow you won't be so smart, or whatever, right? So this is a tricky thing. And you might say, sir, is tarah to phir koi bhi baat nahi kar sakte. You can't say anything, because anytime you say anything about anyone, you end up ascribing some quality to them. And anytime you want to work together with other people to achieve something larger, you at some level are thinking of them as means to an end. You want to do a play together. Everybody wants to do that play together. But you're thinking, in order to do this play, I have to recruit A, B, C, X, Y, Z person. In order to do this project, I have to get Saad and Rafiq and others with me, right? What are you doing? Is that not treating someone as an object? That is what Sartre refers to as the fragility of freedom, and another tension that cannot go away. But what he wants us to do, and what Simone de Beauvoir also wants us to do, is try our best not to objectify people in any way, not to ascribe to them any fixed property, but to treat them in a way in which they are not a means to an end, but an end in itself, not only in the way that Kant wanted it, but even more so in the way of not ascribing to them any fixed identity or any fixed quality. This is very difficult to do, because, and it's very difficult to analyze anything in politics without doing this, right? So if you say Abbas is a left-wing radical, I've done it already. I've objectified him. That's it. And Abbas would react, if he was a true existentialist, in the heart of hearts, he would react by saying, sir, don't label me. And then I would say, you call me sir, you are also labeling me, and so on and so forth. It's very difficult for us to get out of labeling. But you must have heard this phrase, don't label me. I'm no one thing. I am all of these things and maybe none of these things at the same time. Have you heard this? It's a favorite phrase amongst college students like you. No, please don't label me. Paras, are you going to label me? No, don't. Where does the philosophical heritage behind that particular slogan come from? It comes from existentialism and to some extent also from postmodernism. And now you see why it's wrong to label someone. It's not wrong to label someone because the label per se is wrong. Maybe Saad is not, Abbas is not left-wing, maybe something else. So that could be wrong itself. But what is being challenged is not just that that particular label is correct or incorrect, but that the act of labeling objectifies Abbas. Got it? Abbas.
So can't we just name people, or like can't we even name them, like, because we are labeling them?
You can name them in the sense that you are Paras.
Yeah, so, like,
But if I ascribe to you some fixed quality, then that is something that I'm perhaps not doing right. So if I say Paras is a Marxist, right? You'd say, well, maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Today I am, tomorrow I'm not. From moment to moment I could change. So how can you say I am a Marxist, given that I'm choosing what I want to be every single moment from moment to moment? Hence, to ascribe anything fixed to you, given the fluidity of the choices that you are and can make, would be an absurdity. And Sartre's critique is of the social system that tends to do that. He's a worker, he's a peasant, he's a flana, he's an intellectual, etc. The social system, his concern is less perhaps with how you and I talk to each other, but even more so with respect to how the system classifies you, labels you, and then utilizes you as a means to an end. Continue. Next we get to, that's what the city of ends means. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. That's Kant. And projects can be realized only with the cooperation of others. Cooperation presupposes freedom. Absurdity and fragility of freedom come about because as soon as you try to get people to cooperate, you do at some level objectify them. Nurturing the freedom of others must be central to all my projects. That's what Sartre wants you to do, is to nurture that, is to not let it go. Society must be structured in such a way that no section is treated as a means to an end. That's what Sartre the conclusion that Sartre comes to, is that you should make society in such a way that it stops treating people as objects and starts treating them as subjects. Difficult, I'll give you that. I'll concede that to you. Now we come to Simone de Beauvoir. Humanity is constantly oscillating between the facticity, that is the brute fact of existence, and transcendence, which is self-creation. This creates the ambiguity, a tension between what is and what can be. But ambiguity teaches us that our ethical relations cannot be self-referential. In other words, you can't only derive ethics by examining the self, but must be based on the common destiny of humans as a failed and interrelated being. So we've got to talk about intersubjectivity here, whether we are treating each other subjectively, as subjective beings, not subjectively, sorry, but as subjective beings rather than as objects. And of course, her most famous saying, which is, one is not, where is that saying gone? I put it somewhere. Oh, maybe got deleted or something. I don't know where it's gone. But one is not born a woman, but one becomes a woman, right? What does he mean? What does she mean? Sorry by that. She means that she's taking the Hegelian framework where you require self-recognition from another subjective being in order for self-recognition, you require recognition from another subjective being. That leads to a death match. One person submits. The person who submits becomes the slave. The person who wins becomes the master. The slave is set to work. The work is the externalization of the creative powers of the slave. The slave then comes to recognize him or herself from the objectification of their own rationality, whereas the master that forced the objectification from the slave is unable to achieve voluntary real recognition and hence therefore falls so she says a man can find a justification of his own existence only in the existence of other men, but only the freedom of others keeps the woman is treated as the other, but only the freedom of others keeps each one of us from hardening in the absurdity of facticity, which means in the absurdity of treating each other just as objects. To will oneself free is also to will others free, and therefore the goal of Simone de Beauvoir is very similar to Sartre's, which is that we have to evolve a society which treats each other not as objects but as subjects. No! I'm going to finish. So one becomes a woman because a woman at times are complicit in their own situation. Proletariats say we, blacks say we, but women are unable to utter we. They live dispersed amongst men, tied by homes, work, economic interests and social conditions to certain men, fathers or husbands, more closely than to other women. As bourgeois women, they are in solidarity with bourgeois men and not with women proletarians. As white women, they are in solidarity with white men and not with black women. Hence, the female identity is very much bound up with the identity of the men around them. This is what we have to break, and this introduces in feminist thought the idea of the sex-gender division. Sex is one thing, it's biological, gender is socially constructed. And she puts this together with a beautiful phrase, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, is socialized as a woman. Camus, reason is absurd. I'm not a philosopher because I don't believe in reason enough to believe in a system. What interests me is knowing how we must behave, and more precisely how to behave when one does not believe in God or reason. Hegel and Marx have reduced man to history. They are, by the act of historicism, denying man the possibility of creating history and affirming freedom, because you are part of this link in a chain of events with a necessary causation. There is but one true serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Now, existentialism is dark, and I don't want you to be influenced by the darkness of existentialism. Okay, this is, in my view, a philosophical issue, not an actual issue of, well, should I commit suicide or not? Don't please think this, okay? You come to the wrong conclusion, because what they're saying is something quite different. What they're saying is the absurd is simultaneously the awareness and rejection of death. The absurd is not nihilism, but leads to action. It opens the space between the need for intelligibility and the unreasonable silence of the world. The realization of man's mortality pushes us to strive for answers, and therefore, ultimately, to reject death. So, yes, we know that life is limited, we are mortals, there is an end to it, like you said, even an end to the planet. But it is precisely, sort of the revolt against that defines what existentialists want you to think about. Finally, they say a revolution devours its own children, and you can recognize who that is when she started out and when she ended up, season 1, season 8. Maybe you should get the lights so that people can see it. Emma, do you want to get the light? There is but one useful action, that of remaking man and the earth. But in making the revolution, man comes to deny the humanity of others. The slave starts by begging for justice and ends, Daenerys, no, that's not her name. What's her name? Daenerys, by wanting to wear a crown. He too wants to dominate. And Rousseau's idea that man must be forced to be free leads to crimes by revolution. 1789 brings us Napoleon. 1848 brings us Napoleon III. 1917 brings us Stalin. 1920 brings us Mussolini. 1930 brings us Hitler. Oh my God, every revolution is accompanied by a counter-revolution. Marxism is like a religion, says Camus. It has a bourgeois preoccupation with progress. All the time, development of the means of production and development of the productive forces. In the name of the future, everything can be justified. The future is the only kind of property that the master willingly concedes to the slave. The making absolute of the values of the revolution leads to the very negation of the revolution, which is basically the same theme of the fragility of freedom. Yes, I'm almost making it to the end. Existentialism has had a huge influence on art, on cinema, on psychology, obviously on philosophy. Naturally, here is some existentialist art that you can see. It is the idea that art will no longer depict reality as reality exists, but how we phenomenologically perceive it. How do we emotionally perceive reality? How can we depict that in color? How can we depict that in shapes? How can we depict that in forms? How do we feel about a particular sunset or a particular winds sort of blowing through the landscape? How do we feel about that? That's what an artist is supposed to capture. Again, you see more existentialist art here, where again the idea is to capture the feeling. And if you didn't know, here's the end of my thing. You have Woody Allen in cinema, you have Richard Linklater in cinema, but most importantly, did you or did you not know that Batman, The Dark Knight Rises is an existentialist movie? I bet you didn't know that, and you're happy to know that, because Christopher Nolan, in the way that he uses the camera, in the way that he tells his stories, very much derives his ideas from existential philosophy. The Dark Knight trilogy, The Prestige, The Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk are really sort of not only commercially very successful movies, but superb movies insofar as their cinematography and so on is concerned. Finally, in psychology, you have phenomenological psychology, various authors here which you can deal with, various thinkers and scholars here, of which I know nothing. So I'm not going to say anything about them, aside from putting their names out there for you. Existentialism has pushed philosophers and thinkers to deal with subjects that were in the past considered to be marginal, such as issues of sex, death, crime, madness, suicide, deviance, and so on. They have pushed philosophy into the realm of issues that were previously considered not really philosophical subjects at all.